January 17th, 1946. Miami Beach, Florida. In a modest house on Palm Island, a 47-year-old man sits alone at a dining room table set for 12. The cake is untouched. The champagne has gone flat. The phone hasn't rung all evening. 25 years earlier, this same man's birthday parties were legendary. Politicians and movie stars would compete for invitations. Orchestras would play until dawn. The celebrations would make headlines from Chicago to New York. Tonight, the only sound in the house is the gentle ticking of a clock and the distant crash of waves against the seawall outside. Al Capone, the man who once commanded an empire, who made headlines just by walking into a restaurant, is celebrating his 47th birthday with only his wife, his memories, and the growing confusion in a mind slowly being claimed by illness. This is the story of that night. Not the night of a monster or a legend, but the night of an aging man discovering that fame fades, power crumbles, and in the end we all face the same fundamental human truth, that we came into this world alone, and most of us will leave it the same way. By 1946, Al Capone had been living on Palm Island in Miami Beach for nearly 18 years. The house, minus a 14-room Mediterranean villa he had purchased in 1928, had once been a sanctuary from the chaos of Chicago, a place where he could relax with his family away from the constant pressure of running an empire. Now it felt more like a gentle prison. The man who had once terrorized federal agents and commanded the loyalty of thousands was battling an enemy he couldn't intimidate, couldn't negotiate with, couldn't buy off. The advancing dementia caused by untreated syphilis, contracted in his youth and left to ravage his brain for decades. Some days were better than others. On good days, Al would sit by the pool, reading the newspapers and commenting on current events with something approaching his old sharpness. He would play cards with May, his wife of nearly 40 years, and joke about the politicians making headlines. On bad days, he would forget where he was, who he was with, sometimes even who he was. May would find him standing in the garden at dawn, confused and frightened, asking for his mother who had died years earlier. But January 17, 1946, 57th birthday, started as one of the good days. May woke to find Al already dressed and sitting on the edge of their bed, looking out the window at the morning light on Biscayne Bay. "Happy birthday, Snorky," she said, using the nickname she'd called him since they were young. Al turned to her with a smile that for a moment looked exactly like the one that had charmed her when they first met in Brooklyn 40 years earlier. 47 years old, he said. How did that happen so fast? May Capone had spent the better part of a month planning this birthday celebration, though she kept her expectations modest. She had learned through years of watching her husband's world shrink that happiness now came in smaller packages than it once had. She had invited Sonny and his family, of course. Their son would drive down from Miami with his wife and children, Al's grandchildren, who brought him more joy than anything else in his increasingly narrow world. She had also sent invitations to a handful of people from the old days, men who had worked with Al, who had shared his triumphs and survived his downfall, men who might remember that before Al Capone became a symbol of lawlessness, he had been a friend, a boss, someone who had helped them build lives and support their families. The responses had been disappointing. Some had moved away from Florida, scattered to different states to avoid association with the past. Others had simply chosen not to respond, perhaps feeling that acknowledging Al Capone's birthday, even in his diminished state, was still too risky. A few had replied with polite excuses: illness, prior commitments, family obligations, the kind of gentle lies that spare feelings while maintaining distance. May understood. She had lived through Al's rise and fall, had seen how quickly loyalty could evaporate when the power behind it disappeared. She didn't blame the men who chose to stay away. They had families to protect, reputations to consider. But understanding didn't make the silence any less painful. By the week of Al's birthday, it was clear that the celebration would be smaller than hoped, much smaller. May made her peace with it. She would cook Al's favorite meal, a simple Italian dinner like the ones his mother used to make. She would set the table with their good china. She would buy a cake from the bakery in Miami Beach. She would make sure that her husband, on his 60th birthday, felt loved and remembered, even if the world had chosen to forget him. The morning of January 17th passed peacefully. Al spent it reading in his favorite chair by the window, occasionally looking up to watch the boats passing in the bay. His mind was clear, his mood good. He even made a few jokes about getting old, displaying flashes of the wit that had once made him the most charismatic man in any room. May Stew worked in the kitchen, preparing the feast she had planned, pasta with meat sauce, the way Al's mother used to make it, fresh bread from the Italian bakery, antipasto with the good salami and cheese, a bottle of wine that Al could still enjoy in small amounts. Around 2 o'clock, Sonny arrived with his family. Al's face lit up when he heard his grandchildren's voices in the hallway. Nothing brought him back to himself like the sound of children laughing. For the next few hours, the house felt alive in a way it rarely did anymore. Al played simple card games with his grandchildren, his confusion temporarily forgotten in the joy of their company. He told them stories, carefully edited versions of his childhood in Brooklyn, tales of baseball games and street corners that painted a picture of a simpler world. May watched from the kitchen doorway, seeing her husband not as the confused man who sometimes forgot her name, but as the father and grandfather he had always been. In these moments, surrounded by family, Al seemed almost like his old self. As the afternoon wore on, May began setting the dining room table. She used their finest dishes, the ones they had bought during the prosperous years in Chicago. She arranged flowers as a centerpiece. She dimmed the lights to create the warm, intimate atmosphere that Al had always preferred for family gatherings. By 6 o'clock, everything was ready. The table was set for 8. Al and May, Sonny and his wife, the 3 grandchildren, and 2 chairs left hopefully empty for any last-minute guests who might still arrive. The birthday dinner began with the kind of warmth that only family can provide. Sonny raised a toast to his father, speaking about the man who had given him everything he needed to build a good life for his own family. The grandchildren giggled at Al's jokes, even when they didn't fully understand them. For an hour, it felt like any family birthday celebration. 3 generations gathered around a table, sharing food and stories and the comfortable familiarity that comes from years of love and shared experience. May had placed the 2 empty chairs at one end of the table, a quiet acknowledgement of the friends who might still arrive. As the evening progressed, she occasionally glanced toward the window, hoping to see headlights turning into their driveway. The phone remained silent. Al seemed not to notice the empty chairs, absorbed as he was in the pleasure of his family's company. But May noticed, and Sonny, catching his mother's glances toward the window, began to understand the significance of those carefully set places. As they finished the main course, one of the grandchildren asked innocently, "Grandpa, where are all your friends? Daddy said you used to know lots of important people." The question hung in the air for a moment. Al looked puzzled, as if he was trying to remember something just beyond his reach. They're busy tonight," May said quickly, her voice carefully bright. "You know how it is. Everyone has their own families to take care of." Al nodded slowly, accepting the explanation without question. But something in his expression suggested that he understood, on some level, the deeper truth behind those empty chairs. By 9 o'clock, Sonny and his family had said their goodbyes. Work the next day, school for the children, the practical demands of life that pull families apart even when they want to stay together. May watched from the front window as their car disappeared down the street, taking with it the laughter and energy that had briefly filled their house. When she turned back to the dining room, she found Al still sitting at the table, looking at the birthday cake that remained largely untouched. "It was a nice evening," he said quietly. Yes, it was, May agreed, though her voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with happiness. She began clearing the dishes, moving around the table with practiced efficiency. When she reached the 2 empty place settings, she paused. The plates were clean, the glasses unused, the napkins still folded exactly as she had arranged them hours earlier. "Should I have invited more people?" Al asked suddenly. May looked at her husband. This man who had once been the most sought-after host in America, who had thrown parties that newspapers covered as major social events. Now he was asking with genuine confusion whether he should have tried harder to bring people into their home. "No, Snorky," she said gently. "You invited the people who mattered, the people who love you." Al nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on those empty chairs. For a moment his confusion cleared, and May could see in his expression that he understood exactly what those chairs represented. Not just absent friends, but a life that had moved beyond his reach, a world that had decided to forget him. After May finished cleaning the kitchen, she found Al sitting alone in the living room, still wearing the good shirt and tie he had put on for dinner. The birthday cake sat on the coffee table in front of him, a single slice cut from it, most of it uneaten. "Are you all right?" May asked. "Just thinking," Al said, "about birthdays when I was younger." May settled into the chair next to him. She had learned that on Al's clearer nights it was better to let him talk, to let him process whatever memories were surfacing. "I remember my 30th birthday," Al continued, his voice distant. "We had it at the Metropole Hotel in Chicago. Must have been 200 people there. Politicians, judges, newspaper men. The orchestra played until dawn." He paused, looking around their quiet living room. Frank Nitti gave a speech. Johnny Torrio flew in from New York. Even some of the boys from the old neighborhood in Brooklyn came out. We had champagne that cost more per bottle than most people made in a month. May watched his face as he spoke. She had been at that party, young and beautiful in a dress that had cost a fortune. She remembered the energy, the excitement, the sense that anything was possible. "Everyone wanted to be there," Al said. "Everyone wanted to shake my hand, to tell me how important I was, how much they respected me." He was quiet for a long moment. "I wonder where they all are now." May knew where most of them were. Dead, many of them, others in prison or hiding. Some had simply moved on, built new lives under different names, far from Chicago and the memories of what they had done in their youth. "People move on, Snorky," she said. "Life changes. That doesn't mean they forgot you." "Doesn't it?" Al asked. There was no bitterness in his voice, just genuine curiosity. "If someone matters to you, if they really matter, don't you stay in touch? Don't you remember their birthday?" It was a simple question, but it cut to the heart of something May had been thinking about for years. The difference between loyalty based on fear and loyalty based on love. The difference between relationships built on mutual benefit and relationships that survive when the benefits disappear. As the clock approached midnight, May suggested they go to bed. It had been a long day, and Al's good days often ended with exhaustion as his mind struggled to maintain clarity. But Al shook his head. "Not yet. I want to sit here a little longer." May understood. Sometimes, in the quiet hours when the world was asleep, Al found a peace that eluded him during the busy daylight hours. Sometimes the solitude was healing rather than painful. She kissed his forehead and left him alone in the living room with his thoughts and his memories. Al sat in the darkness for a long time, thinking about the man he had been and the man he had become. 60 years old, 6 decades of life that had taken him from the tenements of Brooklyn to the pinnacle of power in Chicago to this quiet house by the sea. He thought about the birthday parties of his youth, when his mother would make a cake with whatever ingredients she could afford, and his brothers and sisters would gather around their small kitchen table. No orchestra, no politicians, no champagne, just family and love, and the simple joy of marking another year of life. Those parties had been smaller than tonight's dinner, but they had felt bigger, more significant, more real. He thought about the lavish celebrations of his Chicago years, when hundreds of people had gathered to honor him. But how many of those people had really known him? How many had been there for Al Capone, the man, rather than for the power and influence that name represented? And how many had stayed away tonight, not because they had forgotten him, but because they had never really known him at all? As Al sat alone in his living room that night, something became clear to him that perhaps hadn't been clear before. The emptiness he felt wasn't just about the friends who hadn't come to his party. It was about the realization that many of those friendships had been built on foundations that couldn't survive the test of time and changed circumstances. Real friendship, real love, the kind that May had shown him for 40 years. the kind that Sonny demonstrated by bringing his children to spend time with their grandfather, didn't depend on wealth or power or status. It survived decline, forgave mistakes, and showed up even when there was nothing to be gained from the association. The men who had filled his birthday parties in Chicago hadn't been friends in that sense. They had been associates, allies, partners in mutual benefit. When the benefit disappeared, so did they. But that didn't make their absence any less lonely. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, May found Al asleep in his chair, his head tilted back, breathing peacefully. The birthday cake still sat on the coffee table, most of it untouched. The house was quiet except for the distant sound of waves. She covered him with a blanket and turned off the lights, leaving him to sleep where he was. In the morning, he might not remember much of the evening. The disease that was slowly claiming his mind often erased the details of recent days, leaving only fragments and impressions. But May would remember. She would remember the dignity with which her husband had accepted his isolation, the grace with which he had found joy in the small celebration they were able to provide, and the quiet courage with which he faced the reality of a world that had moved on without him. Al Capone's 60th birthday party ended as it began, fine in silence. But in that silence there was a lesson that speaks to anyone who has ever lived long enough to see their world change, their circle of friends shrink, their influence diminish. We all, if we're lucky enough to live long lives, face moments when we must confront the difference between the relationships that were real and the relationships that were convenient, between the people who loved us for who we were and the people who needed us for what we could do for them. It's a hard lesson, made harder by the fact that it often comes when we're least equipped to handle it, when age has diminished our energy, when illness has clouded our thinking, when the future feels shorter than the past. But there's wisdom in that solitude, too, in learning to find peace in our own company, in discovering that our worth isn't measured by the number of people who remember our birthday, but by the quality of love we've shared with the few who really matter. May Capone, watching over her sleeping husband that night, understood something that the world had forgotten about Al Capone, that beneath all the headlines and the legend and the fear was simply a man who had loved his family, who had tried in his imperfect way to provide for them, and who in his final years had found a kind of peace in the simple rhythms of ordinary life. The empire had crumbled, the power had faded, the fear had given way to pity, and the pity had given way to forgetting. But the man remained, flawed, damaged, confused by illness, but still capable of finding joy in his grandchildren's laughter, still grateful for his wife's patient love, still human in all the ways that matter most. Al Capone would spend exactly 1 more year in that quiet house on Palm Island, his health continuing to decline rapidly. He died on January 25, 1947, just 8 days after his 48th birthday, in his own bed, surrounded by family. His funeral was attended by those who had loved him longest. The newspapers covered it, but briefly. By then the world had moved on to newer headlines, more current scandals. But in that quiet house on Palm Island, in the memory of a birthday dinner shared with people who loved him not for what he had been but for who he was, there was something more lasting than fame or infamy. There was the simple truth that we are all, in the end, measured not by the crowds who gather when we're powerful, but by the few who remain when we're powerless. And that's a birthday worth celebrating, no matter how quietly it passes. We all face that night eventually. The night when we realize that the party is smaller than we hoped, that the phone rings less often than we expected, that the world has found other things to care about. What matters, then, is not who's missing from the table, but who's still there. Not what we've lost, but what we've kept. And if we're very fortunate, what we've kept is love. Imperfect, patient, enduring love that sees us clearly and chooses to stay anyway. That's the only birthday gift that really lasts.